Started? All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of this presentation on the fundamentals of Catholic morality. Good to see some new faces. Also great to see some returning folks. And for those of you on the live stream or watching this on replay, welcome. Really glad to have you here. And to get started, I always like to just get a feel for who's in the room, find out what draws you here. So if you could go around the room, introduce yourself with your name. And then if you were here last week, or if you watched it online last week, what's something interesting that you learned from part 1? And if you haven't seen part 1, don't worry about it. What is something you want to learn here? What drew you here? What are you interested in this topic? So we can begin with Jenny.
I'm Jenny Rivera. I work and worship at St. Mary's, Grand Rapids. And I came here because it was intriguing, the title, and I always like to learn something that I can better myself and maybe share it.
Thank you.
I'm Darlene Truskowski, and sadly I wasn't able to come last week, but I enjoy coming to these classes, presentations, and still learning.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, my name is Carl, and from last week we got an introduction to morality, and I still struggle with that concept because I think of it as good and bad, right and wrong. But as we learned last week, I think it's ever so much more than that. And that's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, so it's not to negate the fact that there is good and evil, right and wrong, but it's looking at it through the lens of happiness, through the lens of flourishing, through the lens that we do it not to just make sure we're following rules, but actually nourishing our nature and nourishing the humanity of those around us. So yeah, we'll continue diving into that topic, but thank you for sharing.
Dorothy Square. I was here last week and sort of echo what this gentleman said. Intriguing subject, looking at it in a little different way than I expected. So it's very interesting.
Great, thank you.
Learn more.
Karen Wasick, and I would say Patson, Grand Haven. Last week I really enjoyed everything that we discussed, and then again it was way more broadening to me to think about morality and different terms like happiness, joy, and all these aspects, because I relate morality also that you're being immoral more than you're being moral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wonderful. And this class today will go even deeper into that topic about the positive, the good, the flourishing as well. Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Monica Delks, and I'm in the Cathedral Parish, and I watched the latter half of class last week online, streaming, and I just feel that I want to come and deepen a sense of, I guess, more virtue emphasis in my life, especially at Lent, living those things out, because there's sort of a recognition about being made in the image of God, but yet developing a better likeness to that through the virtuous living. So trying to walk the walk and not just talk the talk.
Great, that's another good dimension to this class, and the reason why we're doing it during Lent is it's a chance for deeper ongoing conversion. So, welcome, sir. Just going around the room, people were introducing themselves and what drew them here.
Okay, I'm Ray. I've been taking a lot of classes over the past few years after I retired, and find them very interesting, informative, and so I'm sure this will be the same here.
All right, well, thanks for joining us. I believe there should be another copy of the slides back there. I don't know if there's another printout or if we're out. And for those watching online, my presentation's a Google Doc, so I plan on cleaning it up just a little bit and making it available So after we're done with this, we're going to post it on the website for the CIC, and you'll have access to parts 1 and 2. And as I've been going, just keeping that in mind, I put a lot of hyperlinks so you can access a lot of the sources. And just to give you a recap of where we've been, especially for those who weren't with us last week, I'm presenting this class. I call it Morality 101 because it follows the introductory class that most seminarians take during theology studies in grad school. And my source has mainly been a textbook by Dr. William Madison. And like anything in the Catholic Church, it all goes back to the primary sources of the Catholic Church. So his book actually follows the Catechism somewhat closely. The Catechism is a sprawling document. So I kind of put an outline of the Catechism right here. It has part 1, which is the profession of faith. That's what would be considered systematic theology. Part 2 is the celebration of the Christian mystery. That goes into sacraments, that goes into how we pray, that goes into how God meets us in the sacraments and the graces of the sacraments and whatnot. And then part 3 is life in Christ. So then that's talking about how we live out the mission that Christ gives us. And within life in Christ is where you'll find most of the stuff on morality. And then part 4 is about Christian prayer. So we're in part 3 of the Catechism, life in Christ. And last week we started talking about how morality is intrinsically related to happiness. And ultimately the actions we make using our freedom, when we act with freedom, we're, I dare say, every single time pursuing some sort of desire. Now we have a bunch of desires, but at the root of that is, the Catechism says vocation to the beatitude. Beatitude is another way of saying happiness. It's a little bit more theological perhaps. So it's our call to happiness. And beatitude speaks specifically about happiness in God. And then, so we talked about what would be in the Catechism, Article 2, and then Article 7 speaks of the virtues, and Article 8 speaks of sin. So to really understand what sin is, we need to understand what happiness, what virtues. That being said, it's a huge document, so quite obviously we can't cover all of it in, not even in the 3 hours we have if you add the 2 classes together. But that's just kind of a roadmap of where we are, and if you want to do some future study, I encourage you to look at the Catechism. Within the virtues, it splits it into the human virtues and the theological virtues. So last week we talked about the human virtues, and then today we're going to dive into the theological virtues. There was a question last week about the 7 deadly sins. That's really only one line in the Catechism under the whole section of sin. I'll go into that towards the end of the presentation because it'll make more sense after we talk about the theological virtues. But just to let you know where we are and what we've covered, that's kind of a recap of where we are in the Catechism. But last week the question came up, we want to look at morality, also how we can affect the world, how we can make the world a better place, because we all know that there's a lot of brokenness and suffering and problems. So we talked about the human virtues. We talked about how the human virtues speak to our natural reason, and how they're not distinctively Christian. They came, the ancient Greeks, especially Aristotle, spent a lot of time talking about the virtues. So there are a lot of perspectives on the virtues outside of just the Christian tradition, even though the Christian tradition has taken this thinking and run with it. So I just want to give 2 examples of thinking about virtues from a secular perspective. One is an interesting article by David Brooks. He actually wrote a book, and I confess I haven't read it, but I read this article. It's from 2015 on the moral bucket list. And he talks about the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. So if I were going to apply to a job, I used to be an engineer, so I would show up to the company, and I would have to have a good work ethic, a strong capability, strong technical knowledge. But in the business world, you also have to have a strong financial knowledge, knowing how to match income with expenses. You have to be creative. You have to be a good salesman. You have to have all these kind of skills. But David Brooks says those aren't the things you talk about at funerals. And someone who may succeed and thrive in a lot of those business skills doesn't necessarily translate into a person who would be happy or a person who you'd want to be around. So he came up with this other list of things that he calls the Eulogy Virtues. And he links them to people that he finds in life who he claims radiate an inner light. They're pleasant to be around. They listen to you. They make you feel valued. And it just seems like they're at peace. It seems like they understand goodness. It seems like they're happy. And these are some of the trends that he found across these. This is what he's calling the Eulogy Virtues. So he talks about the humility shift. And that's a profound honesty with one's own weakness. And that's somewhat different from the resume virtues where you gotta really sell yourself and say, you know, I'm perfect and I'm going to contribute. And but really that understanding of your own weakness. And again, that goes back to some of the things we were talking about with thinking about temperance, for example, and just really looking at your own desires and doing a lot of self-reflection. And then he also speaks of what he calls the dependency leap, and that is rooting yourself in others versus the autonomous self. So someone who really feels bound and dependent to a community. And he speaks of energizing love, kind of like dependency. It's love that's centered in another person. And then also the call within a call. So he said it's about finding more in a career than just money or status or fame or security. It's really about finding that sense of purpose to make the world a better place or to transform the world. And then he speaks of the conscience leap, and that's that leap beyond utilitarian logic. So utilitarian logic would be the ends justify the means, or the greatest good for the greatest number. You know, it's all about the outcome. It's not necessarily about the process. And that's distinct from some of the virtues we were talking about, such as justice, which treats everyone fairly, or that sense of you want everyone's flourishing. It's about kind of directing everyone towards happiness. It's not a zero-sum game where you try to get as much as you can at the expense of other people. So David Brooks, it's an interesting article. It's called The Moral Bucket List if you want to look it up. But that's his perspective, and he said, in school we spend a lot of time talking about how to do math, how to have good reading comprehension, how to succeed in the professional worlds, but we don't really get much education on these other things that he says make people profoundly happy. And that's a different level of reflection and analysis than a lot of what the world would exalt and hold up. So that's just one perspective on how people in the secular world are looking at the quest for happiness. There's another interesting article I read in a magazine called First Things, and it's by, I forgot if he's a psychologist. His name is Paul Vitz, and it's called The Sexual Crisis is a Crisis of Character. And he was speaking of different schools of psychology. So he said there was this school of psychology called values clarification, and it says as people are growing up, society wanted to avoid indoctrinating people, so they wanted to really exalt the individual's freedom. So the job of the psychologist or the educator was to help people clarify their values, kind of like pick or determine what it is, what's important to them, what it is they enjoy. That's kind of like picking, which desires you want to act on and whatnot, and then just, letting them go to town. And he cites some of the mottos, like, I don't know if it's Burger King, have it your way. There are a lot of the things you see in the commercial world, which really exalts individual choice and really exalts individual preferences. But he said if you look at a lot of the scandals that are going on right now, you could imagine for someone who likes to exalt their power, likes to, finds pleasure in hurting other people, especially with a lot of the scandals about sexual harassment, sexual assaults, men using their positions of power and influence. He basically said there's been a lot of failures with this approach, because if you try to avoid, quote-unquote, indoctrinating someone, then you end up with a lot of people who just really exalt their freedom at the expense of other people's happiness and other people's flourishing. So that's kind of saying, society took a pretty bad approach here. That being said, there was another psychologist who introduced the field of positive psychology, Martin Seligman. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And if you think about the profession of psychology, they have the DSM, which is all the disorders. And there's no shortage of disorders out there. And that's looking at a psychologist's job as to correct disorders. Whereas he said, well, what about the positive? What about the ways people flourish, and what are the things that people can do to actually live a happy life, as opposed to just avoiding disorders? What can we offer people? And they came up with a list of 6 core virtues. Again, virtues are dispositions, character traits that help people flourish. So this is an antidote to just thinking about the development of people in terms of avoiding disease or disorders. It's a positive flourishing. And then it's also speaking of a lot of character strengths. So the core virtues they came up with were wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. And again, this is from a secular perspective, so it's not exactly Catholic, but it kind of shows that through natural reasoning and through thinking, people are starting to look at human flourishing not in, we'll just leave you alone and you figure out what you like, but trying to think about how can we flourish together, and also looking at what are the traits of happy people. And it's not indoctrination to say, you know, this is what makes people happy, and consider growing in it and try to find these values. Any questions about this?
What is meant by transcendence?
Transcendent, I haven't read much beyond what was just in this article.
Okay.
I would think that relates to what David Brooks would call the conscience leap, or maybe finding the call within the call, that sense of rooting yourself in something that's transcendent. So if you think the whole world is just about me, my tastes, my preferences, what I want, as opposed to a more transcendent, seeing yourself as part of the universe, as part of a greater community. Transcendence takes a bunch of different forms, but that's one way that they look at that.
You say that this is from a secular perspective and not strictly Catholic, but I mean, it certainly seems very Christian,
Oh, yeah.
Catholic. So.
Yeah, and I would say it's compatible. So it's kind of showing maybe a convergence, or it's not to say it all converges, but different strands or different points. But I'd say the bigger message is looking at the development of people not simply in a do no harm or stay out of my way and I'll stay out of your way, but what are some values that we identify that make people genuinely happy, and how can we lift those up, and how can we try to explore them as a community?
I'm just wondering if, like Martin Seligman, or however you pronounce that, if he looked at different religions to develop this whole idea of core virtues.
I would imagine he did. Again, my understanding is very limited just from a paragraph in an article. So I imagine this whole field has definitely taken religion seriously. And I'm no expert in psychology and religion, and there's a bunch of different perspectives out there by psychologists. Some of them would just dismiss religions, others would realize that people who have spiritual practices and are religious, that helps them to flourish in ways that other people may not have access to.
I would be interested in how he would see humanity as a virtue, like to go deeper on that one. Like, is it sacredness of life, all life, or how that connection seems like a stretch a little bit, like as a virtue, because
Yeah.
I think humanity is not really an attribute per se, like wisdom or courage, or someone who's temperate, or
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if it's just recognizing the dignity of others and not using them as means to your own end or your own good, But to be honest, I don't know exactly how they would define that. So, and just another interesting thing that came to mind as I was coming up with this presentation. I read this article in The Atlantic that said, as there's been more of these self-checkout machines, which I'm sure you've seen at Meijer and other establishments, it's saying that theft is going up. And it says people will, take steak and then punch in the code for bananas. So it's 49 cents a pound. Or people will, and it's asking a question, if you want to steal, you can steal, right? But what makes it different about having that versus going through a cashier? And maybe it's more difficult to steal a steak or something. But because it's perhaps easier, maybe because you don't have the human interaction. It said one justification of someone was, well, they're paying me, they're having me work that someone else should be working, so, I can steal this as compensation for me being their checkout teller or something like that. But it was just kind of this question, what is it about humanity that when you're not interacting with another person, or if it's easier, what makes people more inclined to steal than they were otherwise? And that goes back to the earlier question of, do people act justly only because they know they'll be caught? If you had that magic ring that gave you invisibility, would you be unjust? Or do people act justly, do people act virtuously because that's just what leads to happiness? And they say another reason people do this is life is kind of boring, so it's kind of thrilling to get away with, take a little risk at the store and get away with stealing something at the store. So again, that kind of asks, what's your moral development? What is it about your life that makes you feel like that's fun, or that's a good way to live? But I think that's a challenge for us as we look at ourselves as a society, maybe as human interaction is removed in various ways, like as we make these purchases. And that also speaks to the need for good moral formation. Any thoughts on this idea or on this phenomenon?
It sounds a little bit like the same thing as cheating a little bit on your taxes.
Okay.
I mean, you're still kind of stealing, but
Yeah.
it's just not, you aren't holding anybody up or anything. So.
Yeah. And it's a question of how does that change with enforcement? So, if the IRS is only going to go after the really high earners and, I didn't make $2 million and deduct all these business expenses and real estate and this and that, so if my taxes are a bit more simple, then I can, maybe cheat on that. And that's the question of what kind of society do we live in if people don't want to pay their fair share, or if people are trying to get away. And maybe some people feel like, well, everyone else is doing it, so I need to get my cut. But these are all the questions in real life about what drives people to live honestly, what drives people to live in communion with one another, to live ethically.
You see, in the tax code, as with our culture generally, the real enforcement in a democracy is self-adherence to the right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have courts and we have jails and all that, but the ultimate, the government really looks to citizens to do their best when it comes to tax returns.
Yeah.
And it's the exception that comes to light when you get a letter.
Yeah, and we put very minimal resources towards enforcement.
Well, only 1% or less
And
get
that's-
audited.
Yeah, but
Kind of thing.
and that's the sense of there should be a civic duty towards paying taxes and or being honest about it. And if you don't like it, you can change it through democratic means. But that reminds me of an article I read when Greece was having their financial crisis, that they looked at the number of swimming pools, because there's a swimming pool fee, and via satellite or via aerial images, you can just see so many swimming pools that people weren't paying taxes on. So one of the arguments was, well, we're giving you these loans, you guys need to do a better job enforcing the tax code you already have. But in an ideal society, we could spend the money on helping other people instead of just paying for enforcement. And society works best when when people are acting virtuously and not just because they don't want to get caught. And people take chances when there's a less risk of getting caught.
Well, do you think, I mean myself personally, was brought up middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Parents went to college, we all went to college. But, it was so ingrained being brought up, not to steal, not to
Yeah.
cheat, not to be fair, to be good to people. And I often wonder, I'm sitting here thinking, is that just a middle class virtue? Because people with lots of money, you don't see a lot of examples in our society of people with a ton of money doing good things, especially in our leadership right now.
Yeah.
So, it's just something to think about. I'm sure that, they give to charities because they have lots of money and it's a tax write-off.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm a little cynical, but
Yeah. That's a
it
good
doesn't seem
perspective.
right. I mean, I feel rich even though I'm not, but, hey.
I think too, maybe there is maybe a somewhat of a Robin Hood way of thinking in some people that, if, you've got the rich people out there and you're not one of them, and so, you might feel some justification in whatever, doing
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah, it's like the grocery store,
Yeah.
or the government has plenty of money, and why do I need to worry about the extra $1,000
Yeah,
and
and
a
so
$1 billion
you're,
budget, or the grocery store has plenty of money, so they should be paying a cashier, and because I'm doing it, I'm just gonna take some extra.
so you're robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, yourself and your friends, which,
Yeah,
again,
but if you look at it from the other perspective of, well, if everyone's doing that, then the store has to raise prices, and the people that are honest are subsidizing the ones that aren't. Because grocery stores, for example, run a very lean profit margin.
Are we debating whether this is right or wrong, or why people do it?
Yeah,
guess
well,
it's more why people do it.
Yeah,
Are
and-
they
and-
really
and-
dishonest and not?
And I think what I'm trying to get at is the necessity of a deeper virtuous formation that people act honestly, not just because they're afraid of getting caught. Or not only when people are watching, but how do we, because I think we can all see that, when people steal and when people do that, there are a lot of negative effects. We talked about some of the rationalizations. But above that, we need to try to see how can we transform people's perspective to see that we're all in this together, and that we need to act justly in our interactions with other people. But that's just an example of what's going on out there in the world in which we live, and hopefully we can try to educate the people we can educate and make the world a little bit more just in that sense. So now we'll shift gears a little bit, and we'll talk about the theological virtues. We've talked a lot about human reason, but there's ultimately a need for these theological virtues. And the theological virtues really stem from this ingrained human quest for meaning. Aristotle said, all humans desire to know. And we've been talking about reason and happiness and desires, and we talked about desires like being hungry, enjoying a good steak, having fun with friends. But ultimately, those are momentary things, and against the day-to-day lives that we live, there's these bigger questions, there's a much bigger horizon. And some examples are, what came before us? Why is there suffering in the world? What happens after we die? These are big questions that ultimately shape how we live. And one of the things about these questions is that we have to believe something, but ultimately it's a belief because we can't quite prove what happens after death. We can't quite explain why there's suffering. There's perspectives at looking at it, but we can't convincingly explain or prove. Science can tell us a lot about what came before us, but science is still studying the nature of human consciousness. We can still ask the questions, why are we conscious? Why do we even have these questions in our mind? And then as John Paul II says, whether we admit it or not, there comes for everyone the moment when personal existence must be anchored in a truth recognized as final, a truth which confers certitude that's no longer open to doubt. So some people can look at this stuff and say, well, maybe the world is just meaningless. So maybe nothing happens after death. And if that's the case, I'm going to try to get the fastest car I can. I'm going to try to live the most pleasurable life I can live. Maybe some people, they decide that that's just what they believe. Nothing happens after death and they go from there. Maybe some people kind of hedge their bets and say, well, I'm not really sure. I'm going to go to church just to kind of hedge my bets, but I'm not going to eliminate the chance for pleasure in this life, or I'm not going to avoid certain things. And then there's people that say, I really think that there's heaven and hell. That's what I believe, and I'm going to try to live my life in according to that. I'm going to try to live justly, and I'm going to try to follow the teachings of the church, and I'm going to really try to seek and understand God, because I really think that there's a meaning to our suffering. I don't think that we should just completely wash over it. So there's a bunch of different ways of looking at these questions, and ultimately what Pope John Paul II is saying is that you can't not believe something. You have to believe something one way or another. Even if it's, I'm not sure, that's still saying, well, that's what I believe. I believe that I don't really need to change much in my life because I just don't know about that. So this is kind of big picture, and I use this picture of the stars just because it shows us the vastness of the universe and kind of draws us out of our day-to-day and shows us a different perspective.
Are you saying that my atheist friend is caught up in that you cannot not believe in something?
Well, that's a belief. If you say there's no God, that's a belief.
I mean, that's a double negative.
Yeah. So you have to believe, but to make a claim that there is no God is still, they can't prove that there's no God. That's still a leap of faith, just in a negative sense. So, and that ultimately impacts the decisions, how they act in this life. So everyone's decisions ultimately tie back to some larger frame of reference, even if there is no larger frame of reference. So my only frame of reference is this. Like, you still have to look at the edges of reality.
How old do you have to be before this becomes true?
Before you make that definitive moment?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, to be honest. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm questioning
Yeah,
the whole concept
it's
here.
a very, yeah.
Because
As you were reading it, I was thinking, I work with hospice. I was thinking when one is on their deathbed, that could very well come to be the case that short period of time.
Yeah. I think that's what Karl Rahner, a 20th century theologian, would say. It's that, in death our decisions become final.
but what if you die in a car crash?
Yeah.
You perhaps
Well,
don't
you're still
become the
going
type-
through life with some sort of, everyone's going through life with something guiding them, even if they don't, even if they haven't given it too much thought to choose not to think about something or to just kind of leave something undefined is still deciding something.
So this truth which confers a certitude could be a kind of a vague, undefined truth, more of a feeling perhaps than a dogma or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, and it encapsulates the feelings as well. Absolutely. So this introduces us to the theological virtues. Because the theological virtues are ultimately tied towards the broader frame of meaning, the bigger questions in our life. Why are things the way they are? It's one thing to say, okay, I know that I have these desires and I know what it is to make decisions every day. I know what it's like to sleep in. I know what it's like to enjoy a good meal. I know what it's like to work out. I know what it's like to have fun with friends. I know what it's like to go through the day-to-day life. But the bigger questions of, okay, well, where did these desires come from? Why do I exist? Why is this the life I live? Why are these other people in my life? Those bigger questions, ultimately we can't quite prove, but those are the questions that help shape the meaning of what we do. So there's this line from 1 Corinthians. This is part of the famous passage on love. And St. Paul says, "At present we see indistinctly as in a mirror, but then face to face. At present I know partially, then I shall know fully as I am fully known. So faith, hope, love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love." So he ties faith, hope, and love to this concept of seeing, of knowing. And he says, right now we only know partially, which is to say that we can't do faith, hope, and love with the same certitude of science and the same things that we can see and touch. Because as I said, these are kind of bigger questions that go beyond. But there's still questions that we can make claims about, that we can know, even though it's partial. So it's that sense that we know something, but we don't know the fullness of reality. We don't know the fullness of why things are the way they are. But we know enough to kind of push us in the right direction. So that's the introduction to the theological virtues. In the Catholic Church, the Catechism says that the human virtues are rooted in the theological virtues, which adapt man's faculties for participation in the divine nature. For the theological virtues relate directly to God, and they dispose Christians to live in relationship with the Holy Trinity. So, to really understand, or to make claims, to make belief claims about why we exist, what's our destiny, where are we going, what's the nature of justice, these questions all go back to the idea of God as creator. And that's what, for Catholics, gives our life meaning. Those are the claims that we make. So the general act of faith, and this would be the same for atheists, I would argue, is believing in something without clear sight. Because an atheist can say, well, there is no God, but can they explain why the world exists? We can explain that there's atoms and molecules and this and that, but can they explain without a concept of God why that exists? So ultimately we get to that point where there's things that we can't verify. And that's an example of a broader point, but just to make this more specific, when I get in my car and when I turn the ignition, do I know that the car is going to get me home? Do I know that the oil pump's not going to break, or the water pump's not going to go out, or that an axle's not going to fall off, or this or that? Do I know how they tested it? I mean, there's a really good chance, and I get in a car all the time, but that's ultimately a leap of faith, trusting that other people have done this verification. Here's another concept. I have money in a bank account. Do I know where that is? Do I know which computer or which servers Do I know that that money is going to be there? Is that something I can verify? You know, we have the FDIC, we have laws, anti-fraud laws, this and that, but have I gone and read, you know, the terms of my bank account? Have I studied these laws? So we just kind of make these out of trust in that the system in which we live, the world in which we live, it just kind of works. And it's also from, I've put money in my bank account, I've swiped the credit card, I've taken money out of the bank account, I've made purchases, it just kind of works. So without verifying exactly where my money's sitting and which computer server and do I trust the bank and this and that, I'm able to live my life relatively easy. But then there's questions that are even more particular, especially with human relationships. Can I trust other people? Do I know that my family's going to be there for me if I get sick? Can I figure out how people are going to behave in different circumstances, different realities? I mean, I can look at how they're acting now and I can try to make guesses or presumptions, but I can't know for certain. And the thing about faith is that these steps of faith, you can question and you can verify and you can try to test and challenge, but there's always the certain limit as to how far you can get, simply because we just don't have enough time to go through all these tests, and also because there's just a whole host of realities or of possibilities out there that we just don't know how it's going to turn out. So it's impossible to verify everything. And I would think about this through the perspective of maybe a couple that just started dating. And if one person wants to really know for sure, you know, before I give my heart to this person, I need to know everything about him or her. I need to know for sure that she's going to do this. I need to know for sure that she's going to, you know, care for me in this situation, and she's not going to abandon me if I lose my job, or all these questions. But how would a relationship go if someone spent the entire time just trying to verify, just trying to prove, trying to test? To really understand how things work, you just kind of got to take the step of faith, take the believe, give the benefit of the doubt, and then from that perspective inside the relationship, you can see how things develop, and you can see from there. So if you're just kind of standing on the outside trying to look in, it's really impossible to get a good sense of understanding or knowledge about how something works. So that's just showing the need for faith in all sorts of facets of society in which we have. But more specifically through the theological lens, John Paul II says in Fides et Ratio, faith and reason, he begins by saying faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to contemplation of the truth. So to really get to truth, we can't just sit on reason alone, because I've already talked about some of the limits to how far reason can take us. And if we make that step of faith, and we're ultimately going to see how faith is a gift, faith is a grace, but if we take this step and we try to see reality from within the world of faith as opposed to just looking outside, then we can really soar and we can really come to a much deeper, a much richer, and a much fuller perspective of the reality in which we live. And that ultimately shapes the morality that we have.
That statement there seems to be putting faith and reason kind of on an equal standing, if you will.
Yeah.
I don't quite get that in Christianity. I mean, if that were true, that they were equal standing, you would think you would have, reason, hope, faith, and charity as the cardinal virtues.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like the emphasis is always on the faith.
Interesting. So let me open up the encyclical and see. So it begins saying, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises in contemplation of the truth, and God has placed in the human heart the desire to know the truth. So the reference point is still God as the originator of desire, and a word to know God's self, to know himself. so that by knowing and loving God, men and women can come to the fullness of truth about themselves. And it cites a lot of scripture verses here. So that's looking at reason as a stepping stone towards God, but faith, which leads us to God as well, is that ultimate reference point in which we live. So, but, and this is very important for Catholics, we don't just abandon reason completely. So that's one of the richnesses of one of the riches of the faith is having reason there, always kind of testing, guiding, moving us along. And I can just say, as I put this presentation together, I was just really overwhelmed with a lot of material. And there's tons of Bible passages, and I could have picked all sorts of scripture passages, but it's just amazing to see how it all kind of fits together. And there's just this network, this convergence of concepts and ideas that that you can see there's a lot of reason to the way the strands work together, but also that leap of faith is necessary.
There's a book called Faith Informed by Reason, Richard Angula. It's it's a collegiate text, but it's a very good book about this topic specifically.
What is it again?
Faith Informed, Reason Informed by Faith, Richard Angula. So I just,
Okay.
it's a,
By Richard M. Gula,
Gula.
Gula. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you might say that Catholics don't abandon reason altogether, but then you don't know my Catholic wife. I'm just kidding. Bad joke.
Live streaming this, right?
Oh, hope she isn't watching. I'm in deep trouble.
I'm sure we all know unreasonable, what's the, common sense is the least common of the senses.
Right?
My uncle likes to use that line.
Reason Informed by Faith. Reason Informed by Faith.
So let's go back to the idea.
I
Yeah,
just,
Darlene?
well, maybe this should have waited till the end, but I'm just curious, how were you called to do this presentation? Were you requested, or is this something that God called you to do this?
As we were thinking of the program for spring,
Okay.
one of my interests is Catholic morality.
Okay.
And I talked to Father Rene, and he said one of the missions, a mission of the CIC is to help introduce people to the basics of the Catholic Church, especially from the Catholic Catechism. So it was just a natural intersection of,
No-brainer then?
yeah,
Okay.
it's that intersection of my desire and the world's need, or
Okay.
the Church's need in this case. So,
Okay, thank you.
so that's how it came about. So now let's look a little bit at the concept of faith as a virtue. So let's think back to the first presentation. What makes a virtue? What's a virtue?
Habitual disposition of the positivity.
Yeah, so it's that disposition that precedes our actions. So it's that kind of habit within us that drives us to act in a certain way. And a virtue is an action for good, and then a vice is an action for bad. Or it's a habitual desire or an inclination for bad. So faith, in the Catholic perspective, the act of faith, as I've talked about, manifests itself in all sorts of ways. Faith as a theological virtue, through the Catholic perspective, is believing in God and believing in God and all that God has said and revealed, and the Catechism adds, and also believing in the Church and the teachings of the Church. Because ultimately for Catholics, the Church is what mediates and brings us to what God has revealed. So these are just a few of the key points that I took from the introductory text in moral theology. Number one, God is personal. So God is not just some blind cosmic force, but God is personal in the sense that we can relate with God. We have access to God through prayer. And the only reason we have access is because God first initiates the relationship with us. So God makes the first move, and the first move is giving us grace. And God invites us to respond to God's invitation for relationship, and our response is part of our character. So some people can respond, some people can choose to respond to the relationship initiated by God, others can choose to ignore it, can choose just not to think about it, can choose to reject it. And then the other point about faith is that faith completes our human reasoning. Because faith ultimately gives us the biggest understanding of why the world is. So the first key point in Catholic theology is that God created the world. So going back to those questions of why do atoms exist, why did the Big Bang happen, why did evolution happen, all these things that science can tell us, they can tell us how it happened, but science can't answer the question why. We get that answer through faith, through grace, through God's initiation, to say that God created the world. And that's what the Bible will tell you. In two different stories, but the Bible explains how God is the ultimate creator of the world. So that's the first key point. The second reality in which we live is that there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain in the world, there's a lot of brokenness. I'm sure any of us can come up with reasons why the world doesn't meet our expectations. I'm sure any of us can come up with reasons why we feel hurt. And that reality is that there's this reality of sin. So sin exists because humanity has freedom, and humans have the ability to turn away from God or to reject some of the reasons to act on. Remember, ultimately, sin starts in the human heart. Sin comes from desires that we have. Sinful actions are ultimately people acting out of desires or inclinations. So there's that reality of sin as an expression of desire and the way people act on desires that are not in accordance with happiness, that are not in accordance with the good that God wants. So I think that's another crucial reality to understand why the world is. That kind of answer, it doesn't fully answer the question of suffering because there's still deeper questions as to why God allows suffering, but we can say people suffer because people have freedom and people choose to use that freedom poorly. I suffer for my own bad choices, for my own sins. I also suffer for the sins that other people commit that can hurt me. And we do have that freedom to hurt one another. That being said, it doesn't say that the world is, that's one way of looking at the world. And that's the Catholic perspective, and that's the lens that we get through faith, the reality that there's sin. There's some people out there who would, wouldn't believe in sin, or who wouldn't think that they ever did anything wrong, or that there's no need to apologize, or that, well, that's just what I felt, and I did what I felt, and that's that. But, sin, that comes through the lens of faith, to really, truly understand what sin is. It comes through the perspective of faith. But we also know that that's not the end story. We also know that there's this invitation for redemption. There's this invitation for mercy, an invitation of grace, to convert ourselves, to respond, to use our freedom in virtuous ways, to use our freedom to help bring about the world that God wants. So we know that God has a vision, God has a desire for the happiness of people, even though we suffer sin and we suffer in other ways, that we know that that's not the end of the story. So those are the three big thrusts of what faith teaches us. Yeah?
If faith and human reasoning kind of go hand in hand in the contemplation of truth, which is the former side, would it be valid to turn that last sentence around and rather than saying faith completes human reasoning, say human reasoning completes faith? Tricky one.
I'd say no.
Yeah.
I'd say no because the story of Abraham.
Okay.
Abraham reasoned for him to pack up his whole household, his thousands and thousands of cattle, wives, etc., family, and move to an unknown place is not very reasonable.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, it's very not reasonable. But yet, his faith completes that.
Yep. And
By the
that's,
fact that he gets up and goes. I mean, father of faith. That's what we call Abraham, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's just like an example of how I would logistically try to understand that concept. it's not very reasonable if you just look at that alone, without faith,
Yeah,
his move.
Right, but if you
You
don't
know.
have the reason to go with faith, that would imply that it's going to be difficult for you to even contemplate truth,
yeah.
much less come up with a good understanding of and faith in what is true.
I would look at it from the perspective of, we start with the reality of creation. And there's 7 billion people in the world and billions more that preceded us. And that, most of humanity, if not, the vast majority of humanity has a capacity for natural reason. So that God created everything, we look at God as creator of everything, and we look at people start with that base capacity for reason. The next step is, do they complete that reason with faith or not? So reason can exist without faith, but faith perfects reason, because you can take a math test, you can do the SAT. You don't necessarily need faith to do that, because that's from that narrow perspective of people take the SAT for a variety of reasons, But you look at that as a act that's very small. You look at the broader question of what's the meaning of it all? What happens after I die? What happens when I die? Why do what I do?
But-
Those are the questions that faith informs.
Sure, but how about reason perfecting faith? If I linguistically analyze the Bible, will that not perfect my faith and how I believe in the things in the Bible?
There's a lot of professors that read the Bible as a text of language, like as linguists, and or maybe comparative scholars that don't read it through the lens of faith. So they would look at it as, this is an interesting anecdote or historical fact or curiosity, but they don't see through it God as a sacred author informing the Bible.
Okay.
So that's why I would say faith kind of perfects reason, because faith is ultimately about believing in God and understanding the world through that lens of revelation. So where we can only get so far, revelation then completes. And I don't say it completes everything, because there's still a lot of mysteries, there's still a lot of questions. Going back to St. Paul, we see partially as in a mirror, but we will see fully in the end.
To me, it seems like kind of a chicken and the egg question. Which comes first, the faith or the reason?
Yeah. But you could argue, and the church says that God gives the invitation of grace to everyone. Let's take a break, maybe 5 minutes or so. We've been going for about an hour, and then we'll pick up. Are we ready to reconvene?
Yes.
So I came across this quote yesterday morning. I have a book of reflections for Lent, and it's by an author named Henry Nouwen. And he writes, "God exists is the most world-shattering statement a human can make. When we make that statement, all distinctions between intellectual, emotional, affective, and spiritual understanding fall away." So again, it's responding to faith, it's making that act of faith, which we know ultimately can only come because God gives us the grace in the first place. But world-shattering, that transforms everything, that shapes everything. And then we'll skip the conversation because we're only have 25 minutes, and I want to get through the remaining slides. So now I'll talk a little bit about hope. And hope is that longing that we have to be with God in heaven. So hope ultimately is about the promise of heaven, the hope for heaven. And this looks at our human experience through the lens of a pilgrim. That was a category that St. Thomas Aquinas used, or a wayfarer. That's also a category that we see throughout the Bible. As Monica was mentioning earlier, the example of Abraham, the forefather in the faith. Abraham making the journey from his native land to the land that God called him. And it's not just that they showed up and they stayed. It talks about Abraham moving and the fact that he was on the move. And then also the movement of the Hebrew people from slavery into freedom, and then from exile back to the Holy Land. And the church uses the term the Pilgrim Church, and it's ultimately saying that our reality now, our existence, is not finite, it's not permanent, but we're really travelers on our way, and our ultimate destiny is heaven. And an image that's used for the church quite often is a boat, and it's us being together, and it speaks to the reality of suffering, it speaks to the reality of uncertainty, but ultimately when you're on a ship, ultimately when you're going somewhere, you need to have a destination in mind. And having the destination of heaven in our minds, that orients us to the promise that God gives us, and that sustains us on our way, and that as a virtue, again thinking about how this is a disposition that shapes our actions, this should hopefully guide us to make decisions knowing that things are temporary and fleeting. One of the phrases that's often used in the prayers in Mass for Lent is to use wisely the things of the earth. So, through our spiritual disciplines in Lent, we can give up on some of the pleasures of life in order to really understand that our ultimate pleasure and our ultimate fulfillment is going to come through God in heaven. And just as we talked about how faith perfects reason, hope actually helps us perfect our desires. And I love this image. And I chose this image because when we think about our desires, within us I would propose that there's a certain inner restlessness. And even when we are able to have a wonderful vacation, or to have a great time with friends, or a wonderful meal, there's a certain fleeting nature to the things that we experience in life. And it's to say that we're always restless, and we're always, in some sense, incomplete, and in some sense, always striving for fulfillment. And there's a lot of ways that people can respond to this. Some people can just double down and just say, oh, $1 million isn't enough. I want a private jet. I'm going to go for 100 million. 100 million isn't enough. I need 1 billion. I don't need 1 billion. I need 50 billion. So they can just try to keep doubling down and just keep pursuing the things of the earth. Another response that a lot of people have is to live with despair, to lose hope in things. And then what the Catholic Church would propose is that sometimes we need to sit with our longings, our loneliness, our incompleteness, and offer that to God. Not that we try to run away from it, but we try to just acknowledge that, some people say a God-shaped hole in our lives that only God can fulfill, and that this side of paradise, we're never going to get complete and ultimate satisfaction. As I was reading the textbook, another example that they gave was quite often when people dive into relationships, they think, oh, that person's going to fulfill me. I'm never going to be lonely. I'm always going to be consoled. Everything's going to be wonderful. The marriage is going to be perfect. And sometimes when people put all their hope in one other person to relieve any anxiety or distress, that almost certainly, set up for failure. Because ultimately there's these desires, these longings, this restlessness. It's always going to be there, even if we are blessed and fortunate to be successful. And Henry Nouwen does a lot of writing on this, especially on loneliness. He has a book called The Wounded Healer. And one of the images he uses for loneliness is kind of like a canyon that we have. And the canyon reveals the different layers of rock. And it's important to just kind of sit with that incompleteness and just to see the beauty and just to see the different layers within us. And also realize that we can offer our loneliness to God and that we have the hope of heaven, we have the hope of ultimate fulfillment, we have the hope that our longings will ultimately be satisfied. And as I say, that perfects our desires because that can help us put our desires in perspective and can help us to see what are the things I should really be working on. Working on cultivating my spirituality, cultivating loving friendships, not being so attached to material things, especially since the world is passing away, thinking about what's it going to be like when I grow older? Who are the people who are going to be around me? Those sorts of questions. Looking at our life as pilgrims. So that gives us the ultimate perspective. But the other interesting thing that the textbook said, and citing C.S. Lewis, is the Christians who thought the most of the next life were the ones who were most able to transform this life for the better. So quite often with all the sin and the injustice that exists in the world and that permeates the world, ultimately we know that we need God's love, we need redemption. We can't solve these problems on our own. But with the promise of heaven, with the promise that this life is not the end, people are able to take really courageous risks, even to the point of risking their life in pursuit of a cause. And that shows that connection between having hope for the next life and living a little bit happier, or trying to spread happiness, trying to spread justice in this life as well.
Is that, Archbishop Romero?
I put the picture of Archbishop Romero and then Martin Luther King. I could find numerous pictures. Those were just the first two that came to mind, especially as we approach the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. But again, some people might say, well, there's nothing after death, so why trouble myself trying to bring about justice? That's not just, there's other people that say, well, there's nothing after death, so everything needs to be perfect in this world, and I'm just going to strive to build a utopia. And that's not necessarily the right answer either. So there's a lot of activists that don't quite have the theological lens, that don't have that lens of mercy and redemption that can help inform or shape the way they approach the world. And then there's other people that are just completely apathetic. And I'd like to argue that the Christian perspective is somewhat in the middle of that, and is also most effective to transform the world for the better. And then finally, we get to the virtue of love. And a really good passage for this comes from John's Gospel. And within the Gospel of John, there's a really long section. I want to say it's 6 chapters that's dedicated to the speech that Jesus gave and a dialogue that Jesus had with his disciples at the Last Supper. And
Jesus knows that he's going to the Father. Jesus knows that his death is imminent. So that entire discourse, and the Bible is actually filled with what are called farewell discourses, so the speeches that patriarchs are about to give before they die. And that shows how the Bible is, thinks a lot about life through the perspective of death and through the perspective of the next generation. But the farewell discourses in John's Gospel are just exceptional, really, really rich theologically. And just a quick definition of love as a virtue. The quickest definition I'd say is friendship with God and neighbor, relationship with God. So it's one thing to know that God exists. It's another thing to know that heaven exists. It's another thing to actually be in relationship, to be in friendship with God. And the more we know God, the more we know that God created everything. And therefore we have to love everything in God. We love it because God is the one. So there's this passage here. As the Father loves me, so I also love you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my commandment. Love one another as I love you. So this passage teaches us that love begins, as the Father loves me, so also I love you. Love begins with the fact that God has loved us first. We can't just, through our own efforts, create a love for other people. We need to go to the source of all love, which is God. This also shows us the connection of love and happiness. My joy will be in you, and your joy will be complete. So remaining in Jesus' love, remaining in relationship with Jesus, keeping the commandments leads to joy. And then we know what it means to love Jesus, to keep the commandment, to love Jesus, we love one another. And just as Jesus was loved by the Father, because we're loved by Jesus, we're able to love one another. So love teaches us the virtue of love, which is also called charity, to be more precise, teaches us how to love things in the right order. So that's how to really value other people. Going back to the secular virtues that I talked about with David Brooks and whatnot, that leap outside of yourself, that care for other people, centering yourself in another, not just being so self-centered, egotistical, all that. That kind of gets at what our faith is really showing us, but this completes it, because this shows us that the ultimate source of love, going back to the concept of transcendence, this shows us that the ultimate source is our relationship with God. And then there's a few concrete ways, again, because these are virtues, these are dispositions within us that shape how we act. So some concrete ways that we love. We can't love without worshiping God. So through worshiping God, that transforms us. Through worshiping God, that reminds us of God as creator, that reminds us of the gifts that God has given us, that reminds us of God's love for us. And that's our response. That's our friendship. That's how we grow in grace. That's how we cultivate the virtue of love. And then that also leads to loving others in God. And there's a bunch of concrete ways we can do that. You know, when you think of charity, people think of giving money. It could be a gift of time, a gift of self, a gift of presence. And most people can do that pretty well. But the third is probably the hardest, I'd say, and that's practicing radical forgiveness. So the example of love, the greatest example, is Jesus on the cross and Jesus being able to forgive. Jesus teaching us, we did the absolute worst. Humanity did the absolute worst they could to Jesus. And Jesus was able to forgive his disciples for abandoning him. Jesus was able to say, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. And that example of Jesus is still offering love and forgiveness, and we're called to mimic that love. Because again, that is tied to faith, because it shows us the world was created by God. It shows us that God loves the world. It shows us that even in the midst of brokenness, there's the opportunity of forgiveness and the opportunity of redemption. And then going back to that line from Corinthians, it ends with, the greatest of these is love. Of faith, hope, and love, love is the greatest. So I just want to ask you, why do you think that is? I know what the textbook says, but what are some reasons why you think that that's, St. Paul says that's the greatest?
Because it's totally devoid of ego and self. That's God's the biggest attribute is the self-giving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it manifests itself in concrete ways, concrete actions. And it's that
There's
that
no
humility.
me
Yeah,
in it.
exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's one example. Any other ideas? So we were talking earlier about professors of Greek languages or Semitic languages that are experts in the Bible, but I argued that they may not have faith. You know the line in Corinthians that said, if I, and then unfortunately I can't remember now that I have the microphone on, but
The 13, God is
Yeah.
gracious, God is kind, doesn't brood.
but it said,
Then
if
it
I
says, "I'm a
speak
noisy
with
God, speak with a tongue of
Yeah.
angels.
if I speak with the tongues of
Yeah.
angels but have not
Noisy
love,
gone.
then I am nothing. So it's that whole, I may be accomplished, I may be talented,
Give my body over to be burned, but I
Mhm.
have not love.
but yeah, exactly. So it's saying love needs to be at the
Intentional.
root. Love needs to be that intention at the root of the actions to really make them holy. The other interesting thing too, going back to faith and hope, faith talks about things right now, whereas we can see things only partially, but when we get to heaven, we'll be able to see God face to face. When we see God, once we get to heaven, there's no need for faith and hope. So there's no need for faith when we're with God directly. There's no need for hope because we've already arrived at the fulfillment. But heaven is all about that love between us and God. So that's another approach as to why love would be the greatest between faith and hope. Because if we look at our final destiny, the trajectory that we're on, we're ultimately on that trajectory for love.
I mean, and it's like entering the, how would you say, like the Trinitarian dynamism. Like
Mhm.
it's always,
Yeah, that
it's the love that
self-giving
creates
love
that
between the Father, Son, and the Spirit. Yeah, so we'll enter into that in heaven, and we'll see God face to face. And the other thing I would argue is that love is a foretaste of heaven. So the more genuine experiences of love we can experience, we have on earth, the more that transforms us towards acting more virtuously, the more that reinforces the hope of heaven, the more that reinforces our faith. Kind of how we live best once we've taken that step of faith and we say, okay, I believe, help my unbelief, that line in Scripture. I'm going to do this, I'm going to live the Christian life. The more we take those steps, the more we see the feedback around us, the more we grow in love. That's what gives us that foretaste of heaven, which helps reinforce the other virtues of faith and hope. So that's another reason why love is so important. So I'll just talk really quickly. It looks like we have about 5 minutes. The last class we talked a little bit about the 7 deadly sins. I waited to put this at the end because I think it only makes sense after we've talked about the theological virtues. You really need the theological virtues to make sense of the 7 deadly sins. Quoting from the Catechism here, vices can be classified according to the virtues that they oppose, and they can also be linked to capital sins which Christian experience has distinguished following St. John Cassian and St. Gregory the Great. They are called capital because they engender other sins, other vices, and I'll go through the list in the next slide. So the thing about capital sins is that they're not necessarily mortal sins, but they help sins grow, which can ultimately lead to mortal sin. But in and of themselves, they're not mortal. And a couple of people mentioned to me Bishop Barron's work. The textbook I was using by Dr. Madison actually cited a lot of Bishop Barron's book called The Strangest Way. So I know Bishop Barron has done a lot about elaborating the 7 deadly sins. So I refer you to his works. So then here's the list of the 7 deadly sins, but as I've been trying to do with this course the whole time, not so much focus on sin, and it's actually like, I think it kind of does the church a disservice if all we talk about is sin, because that's not exciting or attractive. That makes young people think that the church is just a bunch of rules, that, and as I was talking about earlier, you know, when people think of psychology only as disorders and whatnot, that doesn't really give them much motivation or emphasis to flourish. So that's why I decided to put the virtues first. That being said, if you look at the 7 deadly sins, people would say that the worst of all sins is pride. And that would show the importance of the virtue of humility. And we were talking about love, not being egotistical, centering yourself in another, centering yourself in God. That's the foundation by which we're able to order our other desires and to live the spiritual life. And yeah, these are the other sins. I don't necessarily want to go through them, unless anyone has any specific questions about them. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that calling them capital sins, if people think of them as mortal sins, but then people say, well, you know, I get envious, and if that just turns everything into kind of a trap, or if you think that, then people might, and when I say people, I mean myself, I might say, yeah, what's the point, you know? If I get envious sometimes, if I'm lazy sometimes, and if that's a mortal sin, and then I guess I'm just hopeless, and, you know. Whereas, if you say that it's not necessarily a mortal sin, but it's still something you should take seriously, that way you don't really beat yourself up so much whenever you had a lazy morning, and you can try to bounce back. So, again, if people just say, what, the church won't let me, you know, have a lazy morning from time to time, or enjoy my Christmas shopping list, or this and that.
There's a balance.
If it seems like everything's a trap, then that can discourage people, which is why it's important to focus on the virtues with that.
Why do we talk about sin so much in our in services? You know, we're all sinners. We admit that we're all sinners, and we do that every time we go to mass, don't we?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
No, Mass
why-
always begins
that's
with
what
that.
That's what I have a hard time understanding.
Well, here's
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
What is salvation? What does Jesus bring? Salvation from what?
Beats the heck out of me.
Well,
No.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, we're
that's
in the court.
what premise of
Right.
being saved or salvation or redemption from this.
Yeah.
But if sin is not important, I mean, you just said it's not that much we shouldn't dwell on it, and yet we hear we're sinners every day.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I want to say, like,
yeah.
give it equal time. That's what I would say. Because I think about the story about the woman caught in adultery. Okay, Jesus just doesn't say, I won't condemn you, and lets her go.
Yeah.
He also says, do not sin anymore. They go hand in hand. There's a compassion, but there's also a seriousness.
I think one of the important messages that the church needs to bring and to preach. The world is a broken, fallen place with a lot of suffering, a lot of hardship. And I think the most fundamental thing is to say that God does not want it this way. God has something better for us. God wants a better reality for us here. God wants us to participate in creating a better reality, but God also has in store for us the hope of heaven. And I think that can help people transcend out of the grind of I go to work, do I have enough to cover the rent? Do I have enough to take a good vacation? Those sorts of lower level things. That being said, the Mass always begins with the penitential act, except for Easter season, which is the renewal of baptism. And part of that is that reality that the world is imperfect, and I also need to realize that I'm playing a part in the imperfection of the world. But I also have a hope to make the world better. And if we give people the vision of what God's hope for the world is, how we can participate in that, what happiness is, what joy is, that helps us better understand the sins that we commit, and that'll give us a little bit more impetus to try to avoid sin. But that's why I'm trying to propose that the vision of redemption, happiness, joy is more important than giving people a list of disorders and saying, you're failing to live up.
Well, I'm just trying to figure this whole thing out.
Yeah.
Well, but even that positivity psychology, type of thing, like the approach of that, but the other side too, we can live in not just hope of heaven, but also in the reality of the kingdom is at hand.
Yeah.
We are creating it, and we have a responsibility as Christians when we're sent at the end of Mass, go,
Yeah.
and now be me in the world. Christ is saying this,
Mhm.
And there's a,
And the penitential act is what we've done and what we failed to do. So it's kind of a both and of how have we failed to bring about this vision that God has for the world.
So sin is sin because we're human, basically. Is that what you're saying?
No, sin is still,
We can be human and not be sinful? Is that possible? Or is that too
I need to go back to,
but
it's impossible to overcome sin without grace. The church, I'm pretty sure, would say that.
Can you define grace for me again, please?
Grace is God's gratuitous gift of God's self to help us.
But you also have to accept
Like
it to
unmerited
find
Yeah.
grace, right?
favor.
It's unmerited, and we have to accept it. Going beyond that, I don't remember my Christian anthropology enough to say.
But even St. Paul says when he had a thorn in his side, Jesus, the response is, my grace is sufficient for you.
Yeah.
The grace of God, freely given.
But define grace.
I mean, we should always strive to live without sin, but when we do sin, I think we should just recognize it and try not to get bogged down in it.
Yeah.
And there's that sense of redemption is offered, mercy is offered, and not losing sight of that as well. So we're pretty close to time. Just want to recap. So the 4 cardinal virtues that we talked about, even though we didn't go into depth, temperance is about well-ordered desires, enjoying the pleasures of the world in the right way. Prudence is about making good practical decisions. Justice is about how we relate to one another, and fortitude is how we face difficulty that comes up. And these are within the Western tradition, philosophical and theological. On top of that, we've seen how faith, hope, and love perfect, transform, elevate the human virtues. They give us that broader perspective. And ultimately, they're centered around relationship with God. Knowing God, longing for God, and loving God. So those were the theological virtues. So I know we didn't begin with prayer because I was hoping that we could take what we've learned and really just take a moment of silence and conclude in prayer, giving God thanks for this class, thanks for this time. And I invite you, based on what you've learned, just in your heart, think of one human virtue that you'd like to focus on this Lent, one thing that you'd like to be more attentive, that you'd like to develop. And also think of one theological virtue that you'd like to pray for God for greater